Okay, I was sitting in my atmospheric science class with the climatologist Don Wubbles here on campus, and also Michael Schlesinger. There was constant reference to major volcanic eruptions of the past, and specifically one, that Tambora from 1815, constantly referenced in the volcanological and climatological literature, and about which I knew absolutely nothing. And the Greeks certainly understood that most human deeds of any note are inspired by shame. And that's certainly true in my case. I was inspired with feelings of shame that here was a major geohistorical event that had occurred slap bang in the middle of my supposed historical specialization, namely the Georgian period, the Napoleonic period of the late 18th and early 19th centuries. It was 1815, of course, is a date that rings through the pages of modern history as the date of the end of the Napoleonic era and the Battle of Waterloo. And in fact, the eruption of Tambora occurred only weeks before the Battle of Waterloo. And in many ways, I think it's probably been obscured by the world historical dimensions of that event, of that battle. Suffice to say, I knew nothing about Tambora and was motivated by the shame of my ignorance to discover something more about it. And the more I investigated Tambora, the more I realized I had a major research project, a book-length project on my hands, because it turned out that Tambora was the largest volcanic eruption of the last 20,000 years, so the largest in recorded human history, an order of magnitude greater than the better-known 19th century eruption Krakatoa in 1883. And whenever I say to somebody, oh, I'm working on a 19th century volcano, a major eruption, they say, oh, Krakatoa, and I say, no, not Krakatoa, the neglected, much less known, and yet far greater eruption of Tambora. Now, the reasons why there's such a difference between the profile of the late 18th century, the late 19th century Krakatoa and the early 19th century Tambora eruptions can easily be explained by progress in human communications. Early 19th century, 1815, is still the age of sail, where communications between Southeast Asia and Europe could take many months. Whereas by 1883, the eruption of Krakatoa, the news hit Europe, within days. People knew of the eruption of Krakatoa. There's a photographic record. The disaster was very well documented. This is not true of the Tambora disaster, which set particular challenges for me as an historian. Mouth-watering challenges in a way. It meant my piecing together the global impacts of this event from multiple fragmentary archives. And I'm sort of in the middle of the process of putting together various elements of the story from disparate archives. I've recently returned from Asia, where I spent some time in libraries in India and in China, trying to piece together various aspects of the story, which, as I say, has never been put together. Now, why am I motivated to beyond mere curiosity, why am I motivated to reconstruct this event? The first reason I've already stated, that it was a geological event of historical magnitude and is interesting in and of itself on that account. The second reason, and the more compelling reason, I think, for us in the early 21st century to be interested in this event is the fact that Tambora was an eruption of sufficient magnitude to impact the global climate system for a period of 3 years. It's somewhat unique in that respect, and certainly unique in the modern historical record. If we cast our minds back 20 years to Pinatubo, we all remember the eruption of Pinatubo in 1992. It was actually coincided with my first year in the United States. I was in graduate school in New York City, And it was a very cold winter. I don't know if you remember how cold 92 was. We had multiple blizzards in New York City. It was very cold. And the only coat I brought was this one, my father's coat from 1960. And it looks rather hefty, but is in fact quite thin and not at all suitable for weather below about 45 degrees. And so I froze that first winter, and it turned out that was a volcanic winter caused by the eruption of Pinatubo in the Philippines, which had an impact on global climate, but only 1/6 of the degree of the impact of Tambora 200 years ago. So actually, the eruption of Pinatubo and the studies that were done of it really aided modern climate scientists in their understanding of the impact of the eruption of tropical volcanoes on world climate. And a lot of what I'm doing is it's sort of extrapolating backwards from the studies of Pinatubo onto Tambora to understand how the impacts work. And I will, as I move through the talk, I will be showing you, or at least sketching you as best as a cultural historian can, I'm not a scientist, how the climate system was impacted by Tambora. So the fact that the eruption had global implications meant, and this was, I think, the aha moment for me, the moment when I realized I had a major research project on my hands, was that Tambora offers us a profound and almost unique, well, I think unique, case study in the global impacts of drastic climate change. Nothing has... volcanoes are the sole natural forcing agent of climate change that is in any way equivalent to the impact of the burning of fossil fuels over the last 250 years. So what we have with Tambora in its 3-year impact on the climate is a case study in rapid climate change. It goes in the opposite direction because volcanic dust has the effect of cooling the climate. But when we think about the relationship between anthropogenic climate change of the 21st century and volcanic climate change of the early 19th century, independent of temperature, the impacts on the disruptions on precipitation, and on growing seasons means that the two cases can be brought into sort of useful analogical relationship with each other. So I'm treating the project as a case history, as one that is interesting unto itself because the Tambora event has been so neglected, but also interested in it for the lessons that it might teach us about what is the impact on human agriculture and societies in situations of drastic climate deterioration, which is certainly what we saw in the years 1815 to 1818. Now, as you might glean from that brief description, the project has multiple interdisciplinary dimensions. I myself am rooted in European cultural history, but it means that I need to expand my horizons, particularly toward climate science and food science. And in order to do that, I've been collaborating with various people on campus, including Don Wubbles. And we've recently completed an NSF application for a digital reconstruction or computer modeling of the Tambora event, which will produce a kind of global Tambora map that will show us the impacts at different times over the 3-year period on temperature and precipitation across the globe. If we get funded and if we're able to run the simulation, this will provide a wonderful scientific foundation for my narrative, because I'll be able to plot the different social and human impacts across the globe and relate it quite specifically to the computer model. As this project has grown, and with it the interdisciplinary dimensions, I've begun to conceive of it as a kind of new, a paradigmatic example of a new form of cultural history, interdisciplinary cultural history, that I'm calling sustainability studies. And the idea of this is that we know that sustainability means essentially the interdependence of human and natural systems, and an understanding of the interdependence of human and natural systems. This understanding, I think, is rather thin in the disciplines in the humanities, in my corner of campus, which tend toward anthropocentric models of understanding history, very much focused on the human, as the term itself, humanistic, implies. Very much a focus on human beings, their psychology, their behavior, their history, their forms of social organization, often with the natural world as a kind of scenic backdrop to the unfolding of human events. Now, I think in the early 21st century, an imperative is growing for humanists to shake off their anthropocentric habits and move toward new forms of research that demonstrate an appreciation for the interdependence of human and natural systems. So I think that is the driving force behind the project, trying to integrate an understanding of the climate disruptions of the 1815 and 1818 period and its impacts on the pre-industrial agricultural societies of the globe in that period. All right, that's enough by way of introduction. Let's get into the story. Now, Tambora is located in what was then the Dutch East Indies on the island of Sumbawa. Here, I was there about a month ago and climbed the volcano, which in 1815 was the tallest peak in the Dutch East Indies. It was just under 6,000 meters tall. The eruption destroyed half the mountain. It is now just under 3,000 meters tall. So it's this long, recumbent thing. It takes forever to hike up through the jungle with an enormous crater. Now, of course, Indonesia is a part of the notorious Pacific Ring of Fire, a string of volcanic peaks all the way along here. And the culture in Indonesia, the history of Indonesia is defined by its periodic eruptions. Here's the island itself. Bima, where I landed, is here, and I spent the worst 10 hours of my life driving from here over to the peninsula of Tambora, the worst roads I've ever seen in my life. I would have put up yellow tape that said, police line, do not cross. But so it took about 10 hours and there is Tambora. And interestingly, the villages of Sumbawa keep clear of the volcano. There's a long oral history surrounding the volcano, and the Sumbawans are still very wary of it and don't live anywhere near it. The village where I stayed at the base of the mountain overnight is populated entirely by people from Lombok. They're the only ones who will come over and live near the volcano. And when we could smell the sulfur in the air as we were at the top. And my guide said, "Well, I hope today isn't the day." And I was like, "I hope so too." But it was a remarkable climb and quite a sight. So now on April 10th, this is another Indonesian volcano. Of course, Tambora has lost that conical shape now and is rather flat. So on April 15th, 1815, occurred in Tambora the largest eruption in the historical record, probably of the last 20,000 years, up to 100 cubic kilometers of magma, sulfur, chlorine and fluorine gases were ejected almost 30 miles into the atmosphere. Now, this occurred right before the rice harvest and destroyed the rice crop across the region entirely. 10,000 people died. These are very rough estimates. 10,000 people died from the explosion, and almost another 100,000 from the ensuing famine. What occurs with volcanic ash is that, for those not consumed by the lava, the volcanic ash poisons the waterways, and so people die from drinking water. And tens of thousands of people were made environmental refugees from this disaster. As I say, it was cut almost in half. There's the smoking caldera now, as it is today. Now, the range of the ash was about 800 miles, as far away as the Spice Islands over here and over to Sumatra. It was audible. The explosion was audible 1,500 miles away. So it's really an extraordinary eruption. And in Java here, in this range, the ash piles range from 3 to 6 feet. Now, at this time, Java was briefly in the hands of the British. The Dutch had been the predominant European power in the East Indies for more than 100 years, but in the Napoleonic Wars, this all changed. The Dutch were displaced first by the French and then by the British. And so what historical accounts we have are from the British administration in Java, particularly Governor Raffles, who, of course, is better known for going on to found the island of Singapore in 1819. But at this time, he was here in Batavia, now Jakarta. And this is what Raffles wrote about the day of the eruption. The sky was overcast, and this is about 300 miles away. The sky was overcast at noon with the clouds of ashes. The sun was enveloped in an atmosphere whose palpable density was unable to penetrate. And amid this darkness, explosions were heard. So the entire region was plunged into darkness. One of Raffles' officers, who was here on the eastern coast of Java near Bali, he wrote that so violent and extensive eruption has not happened within the memory of the oldest inhabitants, nor within tradition. The extreme misery to which the inhabitants have been reduced is shocking to behold, he wrote. There were on the roadside the remains of several corpses, and the marks of many others had been interred. The village is almost entirely deserted, and the houses fallen down, the surviving inhabitants having dispersed in search of food. So the Tambora story begins as a natural disaster story for the people of the Dutch East Indies, a devastating disaster that had immediate impacts in famine and starvation, but also in social disruption. It even 60 years later, a visitor to the island of Sumbawa found that almost the entire population of Sumbawa were slaves and had been enslaved as a result of their desperation after the eruption of Tambora. Farming, they're well known as horse breeders. So all the industries and farming on Sumbawa, of course, came to an abrupt halt. And the only social safety net existing in this part of the world at this time was to enter into bondage, to sell oneself as a slave. And so almost the entire population of Sumbawa were enslaved as a result. Now, let's begin to look at the climatic impacts of the eruption. So Sumbawa is down here, 6 degrees south of the equator. Now, the volcanic plume ejected 30 miles into the atmosphere. It begins by heading northwest with the trade winds. It's 6 times larger than the volcanic cloud of Pinatubo. Think of it as really the size of Texas and Illinois combined, moving through the upper stratosphere. Now, what happens with a major tropical eruption is that the volcanic cloud circles the globe on the equatorial winds. Yeah? So it circles the globe. Within a couple of weeks, volcanic dust has circumnavigated the globe. It then begins the longer process of dispersal toward the poles. So you have volcanic dust here in a band around the globe, then gradually filtering down toward the poles. And one of the ways that paleoclimatologists have been able to reconstruct the impact of Tambora is through the examination of ice cores at the North Pole and the South Pole, where the Tambora signal of carbon isotopes, sulfur isotopes, is the loudest signal there is in the geological record. So now what happens as this enormous band of volcanic dust disperses across the hemispheres is that it begins to alter wind circulation, temperature, and the dynamics of the world's major weather systems. It's a kind of reverse greenhouse effect in that the impact is the filtering of sunlight and hence the cooling temperatures. By reducing the temperature differential between the air and the land, the first thing it does is diminish or depress monsoonal circulation, which depends on the differential temperatures between land, sea and air. So the major weather systems of this part of the world, through the Bay of Bengal, the most spectacular weather systems in the world, the Indian monsoon, are depressed. And the winds here, the trade winds, slow down, and there's a general kind of breakdown in the circulation. Now, something I'm going to talk about a little bit more is that the monsoonal disruption here caused by Tambora impacts the disease ecology of the Bay of Bengal. And the major impact of the eruption that is felt here in India is 3 years of sustained harvest failures, but beyond that, also the development of a new epidemic strain of cholera. So the impact is not simply on crops, on crop yields, and the short-term impacts of food shortages, but also on the development of disease. I want to talk about that a little bit more. I visited Bengal, was there last month, and then I hopped on a plane across the Himalayas to Yunnan in China, where, for a variety of reasons that we don't yet fully understand, the impact of Tambora was felt most acutely, more acutely than anywhere else in China, and you have devastating crop failures in Yunnan. And what drew me to Yunnan was the existence of a body of poetry by Yunnanese poets describing the suffering of the people in the time of the Tambora famine. Giving that, and the poetry itself provides a kind of historical documentation for what occurred on a day-by-day or week-by-week basis through the years 1815 to 1818. Now, let's move on to the Western Hemisphere. So moving from China, where you have unprecedented summer snows in Tibet and flooding and crop failures, here in the Western Hemisphere, the major northern hemispheric climate-producing systems are impacted. Now, in particular, the Icelandic low here, it's the changing dynamics produced by the volcanic disruption shift that system southward toward Europe. So the Icelandic low, the Arctic Oscillation, cools temperatures in Europe and North America by up to 5 Fahrenheit on average, okay, during the summer growing season. Now, if you think about 5 Fahrenheit, we on a simply experienced on a daily basis, the difference between say 20 degrees and 15 degrees would not discomfort us altogether too much. But as I'm sure some people in this room would know, that taken on an average, even a 1 Fahrenheit differential in temperature will reduce the growing season substantially. So when you have a 5 Fahrenheit difference on average during the growing season, you end up with something quite disastrous. And sure enough, you have, with summer frosts, endless summer storms and summer frosts in Europe, and over here in our part of the world, you have frosts in July. Okay, in 1816, the so-called year without a summer, you have in New England the shortest growing season on the historical record. I'll talk more about that and its particular interest for us here in Illinois and how that the impact of the failed New England harvests on Illinois. So in Western Europe, just to give some sense of the range of social impacts, there were record high. What happens in a period of dearth, a period of shortages, of course, pressure on food prices, something that we're seeing today again. So you have record high cereal prices across Europe, and about 200,000 deaths, an extremely high animal mortality. And in Ireland and Italy, you have a severe famine-friendly typhus epidemics. The typhus is usually associated with famine conditions, and sure enough, typhus is a serious problem. Yeah. Also, you have major demographic disruptions here in Europe, with droves of European peasants on the march, abandoning their farms and abandoning their homes, setting out on the roads of Europe toward the Dutch ports to head across the Atlantic to North America. Okay? So there's a major bubble of migration in this period, and also eastwards toward Russia. There are accounts that I've been reading of tourists, travelers in Europe at this period, who mistook the bands of beggars and environmental refugees on the roads for armies. They thought they mistook them for armies on the march, just vast hordes of people on the move. Now, you might be asking yourself, why is it that I haven't heard about this? Why isn't this something that I learned about in school? Why wasn't there a whole chapter on this? Well, I think the reason is that because we're talking about 1815 and 1816 here, and if you see the traditional historical account of Europe in that period is, well, this is part of the disruption and the civic disorder result as a natural result of 20 years of warfare on the European continent. This is soldiers returning from the wars. These are all human-induced disruptions. But in fact, there are what I'm seeing in my research is that there's a combination of human and climatic drivers here. That in fact, the climate disruption produced by Tambora was amplifying a lot of the social disruptions that were consequent on the end of the Napoleonic Wars. Now, to come across to North America. We have, of course, I'm a my origins are in literature, okay? And the literary historical hook for this project is, let me just go back to Europe there, is that there was a concentration of literary talent on the shores of Lake Geneva in 1816, coincidentally enough. Mary Shelley and her husband Percy were holed up in a villa on the shores of Lake Geneva with Lord Byron, the most famous poet of the age, and they were stuck inside. They'd gone there for a summer holiday, and they were stuck inside because it was cold and wet the whole winter. And they decided that they would, in order to amuse themselves, they would compose ghost stories. Of course, the most famous ghost story of all, or the most famous romantic story, horror story to come out of that was Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. A direct sort of cultural product of The Year Without a Summer, 1816. And here's Lord Byron, who wrote a poem that literary critics for generations have believed was a kind of allegory about the end of the world, but is in fact a vivid and literal description of a particular day in June of 1816 when the volcanic cloud positioned itself directly above Switzerland, and it was dark for 24 hours. This poem, Darkness, the bright sun was extinguished, and the stars did wander darkling in the eternal space, rayless and pathless, and the icy earth swung blind and blackening in the moonless air. Morn came and went and came and brought no day, and men forgot their passions in the dread of this, their desolation. What I like about this, I mean, it's an extremely vivid and powerful poem. What I like about this is the way that Byron manages to connect the ecological disaster with the human impacts. The idea of the bright sun extinguished and men forgetting their passions in the dread of this, their desolation. So connecting the ecological event, the climatological event, with its human impacts and human suffering. Just as a matter of interest, this is the villa where they were, the Villa Diodati. You can't visit it now; somebody else owns it, so you're very lucky if you can get in there to see it. But that's where Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein during the summer of 1816. So, to give you a broad picture of the book, I've got, a comprehensive global survey is impossible, but I'm doing the best I can with 6 separate regions. The book begins with a study of the ground zero impacts of the eruption, which I've already discussed. The next chapter deals with, as I adumbrated earlier, the impacts on India, which I think are the strongest argument that I have for the global significance, the global geohistorical significance of Tambora's eruption, in that historians have always wondered about the connection between the bad weather of the 1816 and 1817 and the occurrence of a new epidemic strain of cholera in that year, 1817. You find a strain of cholera. Cholera is historically endemic to the Bengal region and to Calcutta. Perennially visits those populations. But in 1817, suddenly we have an epidemic strain that begins traveling west through India and southeast through the East Indies, and then ultimately travels through the path networks of global trade to Europe and North America and the rest of the globe. And by 1850, you have 10 or 20 million dead globally. I mean, cholera is the great epidemic disease of the 19th century. And it begins in 1817 in Bengal, and the historians have always noted this coincidence without being able to produce any kind of material causal connection between the disrupted weather of the period and the development of the disease. That has changed now with new advances in epidemiology, which have shown that there are strong correlations between altered monsoonal conditions, alterations in temperature and precipitation, and the conditions for the dynamic alteration of the genetic makeup of the cholera bacteria. And this is, it seems almost certain that this is what occurred in 1817. So we see Tambora is connected to cholera and the 19th century global epidemic of cholera, which, of course, we're still in the midst of a cholera epidemic. We're now in the 7th cholera epidemic. And the scientific understanding of the relationship between climate and cholera, between climate and disease ecology, is becoming more and more important. And the historical example of Tambora is extremely relevant to that. In cholera, just to expand on that, I suppose I'm running out of time, but just to expand on that briefly, cholera has been enshrined in the history of modern civilization and in modern medical history as a kind of triumph of the formation of a new paradigm for understanding epidemic disease, namely that it is essentially social. It's poor sanitation and poorly infrastructured human conditions that produce epidemics. And if we need clean up water and create efficient sanitation infrastructure, then we will be immune from something like cholera. It turns out now in the early 21st century that this is not so clear cut as we believed, and that there are climatological drivers to the occurrence of that. First of all, the cholera bacteria is present globally. You can find it in Australia, you can find it in Chesapeake Bay, you can find it in Scotland. It's not simply an Asian disease, okay, that can somehow be controlled. It's everywhere, and it can become pathogenized by climate as much as anything else. Okay. I've discussed some the terrible famine in China, the impacts in Western Europe. I'd like to just talk briefly about Illinois and the impacts in the United States. And I think one of the most interesting, this project has brought me into various interesting encounters with researchers of different stripes. But I think the most interesting is my visit to Springfield to meet with an amateur historian in Springfield who used to work for the city council, but who lost his legs in a sewer accident about 20 years ago. And he's a man of very little formal education. And he woke up in his hospital bed with no legs and just a small pension from the city, wondering what he would do with the rest of his life. And he decided that he would take up his interest in history, in Illinois history in particular. And the first decision that he made was to avoid Lincoln. Okay, he was not going to, because Lincoln was too well, he wasn't going to do Lincoln, so he started spending his time at the court and looking up old court records and documents, and became interested sort of in the minutiae of early 19th century Illinois history, and became drawn in particular to a phenomenon that is known to Illinois historians as the Panic of 1819, a big economic collapse, a little bit like the one we experienced in 2008, but much worse. And being the extremely intelligent and highly instinctual historian that he was, it didn't take him long to realize that there was a connection between the economic collapse of 1819 and a series of events dating back to 1815, 1816. Now, what happened, in brief, was that when the harvest failed in New England and in Europe, there was an enormous demand for grains in the whole North Atlantic region. And for whatever climatological reason, and I haven't sorted that out, this area, the Midwest, was less impacted by the climate deterioration of the period. So you have an enormous demand for Midwestern grain. The amount of grain traveling down the Mississippi to the port of New Orleans, and from there heading up the East Coast and to Europe, increased by 6-fold in 1 year. Kentucky went from having no banks in 1815 to having 36 banks in 1817. So this incredible inflow of money and speculation of the magnitude that you wouldn't believe. David Brady, who's the name of the historian, has found documents that show land was being bought and sold in Illinois in 1816 for as much as parcels of land for $20,000. I mean, which I need to see the documents to be convinced that that could possibly be true. But there was a huge real estate speculation bubble here. And of course, in 1819, once the grain-producing regions of Europe and New England came back online, okay, demand collapsed and prices collapsed here in Illinois, and a huge economic depression, a severe economic depression ensued in the Panic of 1890. All of those banks went bust. So that gives you a flavour of the kind of story that I'll be able to tell here, one that makes sort of teleconnections between the climate event at the macro geological level and small-scale regional impacts on human communities across the globe over this period. Now, the very last section of the book deals with the Arctic Circle. And one of the anomalies of a major tropical volcanic eruption is that while it produces overall global cooling during the summer, there is winter warming in the Arctic. This is one of the unexpected findings resultant from the study of the Pinatubo eruption. For complex reasons, the temperature over the poles in the post-volcanic period warms up. So in the Arctic, you have British whalers coming to the Admiralty of London in 1816 and 1817 saying there's no ice. We can't. It's amazing up there in the pole. And the Lords of the Admiralty thought, what a wonderful new project for the British Navy. Now that we have all these captains and lieutenants kicking their heels on the shore after the defeat of Napoleon with nothing to do, and the cultural prestige of the Navy declining by the day, here's a wonderful new dramatic initiative that we can embark upon, namely polar exploration and the search for the Northwest Passage. So they begin sending their first expeditions, Franklin and Parry, up to discover the Northwest Passage. And over the next decades, polar exploration asserts itself as one of the major cultural iconic enterprises of the West in the 19th century. Again, teleconnected to the post-volcanic moment of 1816, 1817, where you have a diminution of Arctic sea ice and the idea, the emergence of kind of quintessential 19th century fantasy that perhaps a Northwest Passage could be found. Of course, this is ironic to us now because the Northwest Passage has, for the last couple of years, been opened for several weeks in the summer. So we're now that fantasy is finally being realized. Now, I see that I have gone over time and should probably... No? This is fine? Okay, well, I do have time for a brief summary of what I see as the social impacts that I'll be cataloguing and narrativizing in this study. That what is the takeaway message from this case study of drastic climate change on the global human community? We see multiple examples of each of the following. We see a demographic disaster, that is high mortality rates and dramatic lowering of birth rates in human communities across the world. Refugee crisis. People uprooted, displaced from their homes, unable... We're talking about a mostly pre-industrial subsistence agriculture societies here, so which are adapted to harvest failures of certain dimensions, to one or two years of downturn in crop yields, but not to 2 or 3 years of serious diminution of crop yields, at which point many people cross the threshold from attempting to withstand the crisis to simply abandoning the farm and leaving. You see that across the globe. security deterioration. You see a lot of civic unrest, a lot of violent conflicts between within states and between states. In the Dutch East Indies, for instance, you see the revitalization of piracy, economic upheaval. It goes without saying that you have extraordinary economic depressions of different kinds due to the pressure on grain prices and the loss of productivity. Political instability across Europe. It's been called the last great subsistence crisis in the Western world, where Europe was witness to large-scale civic unrest, food riots, etc. And the reaction of the European governments in this period was a shift to the right, a shift toward authoritarian, draconian government, sort of police state kind of character of their response to the crisis. And also, in terms of global trade, protectionism. Once at the first signs of dearth, the first signs of food shortages, countries, states throw out trade barriers to try and halt the outflow of food, which, of course, given the depth and extent of this particular crisis, was a short-term measure that was in fact disastrous. And one can see, in a comparative study, say, of the different impacts of the 1816, 1817 famine in Europe, that Switzerland, in fact, suffered the most. And there's a direct correlation between the extent of its crisis and its political structure. If you think of Switzerland being constituted of individual autonomous cantons who immediately set up barriers to the trading of grain, they suffered the most. Whereas just next door in France, which in the post-Napoleonic epoch had a more federated structure centered in Paris, Paris was able to organize a relief, was able to organize humanitarian relief on a greater scale and redistribute grain from areas of lesser need to areas of greater need. There's a measurable difference between the social impacts in Switzerland and France. So these are the kinds of things that I, as a cultural historian, am interested in. It's like, how can we map the specific? How can we look at a climate and ecological disaster of this dimension and its impact on human communities, not just in the broadest scale sense, but in a fine-grained sense, and see whether there were ways in which different societies, different communities across the globe were more resilient or less resilient to this ecological disaster. Were there some that were better adapted to dealing with the crisis than others? And if so, what were those? What were the features of that resilience that enabled them to minimize their vulnerability to the stresses of 3 years of sustained shortages of crop yields? So what we have is, by any metrics, and here are just some of them, we have in Tambora a human, economic, and socio-political disaster of geohistorical dimensions. And what I want to do here, what I'm doing with the project, I see it as a departure from the traditional surface depth model of historiography. It's an interdisciplinary model. It's a kind of eclectic approach, as you might have gleaned from my presentation, which jumps here and there. I retain one foot in my home discipline and then attempt to saturate myself in an entirely different discipline, whether it be volcanology, climatology, or East Asian history, things I don't know very much about at all. Now, the only reason that this is made possible, to my mind, is by the digital revolution, the digital information age, which radically shortens the time investment necessary for me to gain a working knowledge in another discipline. So I can't see myself being able to do this, say, 20 or 30 years ago. And I see that this project is an opportunity, or an example of seizing an opportunity as a humanist to become more versatile and more interventionist in 20th century ecological studies. As I see it, as a humanist, humanists lost their mantle in the 20th century as social thought leaders. And interdisciplinary work, enabled and accompanied by the tools of the digital revolution, will help humanists return to centre stage in addressing the major social questions of our time, such as climate change. Now, I've tried to offer an example of this today, and I want to leave you with an image of the smoking crater of Tambora, which I had the privilege to see firsthand last month. So, thank you very much for coming, and I'm happy to entertain any questions.
Sure. Well, thank you.
Did you find from the document how long the eruption lasted?
So the question is, how long did the eruption last? There were rumbles. There were rumbles from the volcano for a few weeks, and we had an early eruption on, I think, the 8th of April, at which point the colonial government sent investigators to Sumbawa. They had time to get there, and on April 10th, the volcano blew, the major eruption occurred on April 10th. And the duration was less than 24 hours once the eruption occurred, once the major eruption occurred, but there were early signs of it. Yeah. So within April 10th was the main day. And there were explosions continued through to April 15th. So, there were, from what I know, it occurred principally in the course of the day. Yeah.
So, are you viewing this as the last straw, maybe in Europe, given what else was going on, as a tipping point, or are you viewing this as a causative factor?
Right. Well, that causality is there is a key concern of the historian, and I think that when people talk about the relationship between climate change and human affairs, and you see it now with people attempting to assess the issue of the impact of climate change on 21st century society, they tend to use terms like amplification rather than direct cause, and that what climate change will do is it will amplify already existing pressures or stresses, and then what needs to be determined is exactly the degree of that amplification. And so climate change is one of these factors that is in a kind of menu of causes. So I think what you see in Europe post 1815 is an already destabilised and impoverished scene, but whose impact, the impact of that, the aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars, amplified then by a sequence of failed harvests brought about by volcanic weather. And in fact, I think I would go even further than that in the European example, and say that this really does overturn the accepted historical consensus about the post-war period, was that the political and social disruptions of that period were due to the return of en masse of soldiers into to their home communities, flooding the labour market, then therefore there being huge rises in unemployment and what have you, and therefore you get all these social disruptions, and you see the lurch of the political equilibrium in Europe toward the right. And all of this can be explained by the aftermath of the wars. Well, I think if you minus the climatic deterioration, there's no reason why we should accept any of those factors as being inevitable. I think certainly with the return of the soldiery, you have pressure on labour markets, but it's nothing that an ordinary succession of plentiful harvests might not have absorbed. So I think it's the flooding of the labour market, and then you have 3 years of food shortages. That's what creates the explosive political situation that really creates the character of post-war Europe in many respects. So I think to answer your question in brief, I see it as a major factor. It's certainly not the sole factor in the political reconstitution of Europe post-1815, but a major factor that is almost entirely overlooked.
Any other questions? Okay, well, thank you again.
Okay, thanks very much.